Hey, welcome everybody to Woods Hole Historical Museum's virtual conversation. I'm Debbie Scanlon, the museum director, and we're delighted to see you all. These talks have been very popular, and it's great to be able to connect with so many people in spite of the pandemic. We're planning to have the museum open this summer with new exhibits, still with masks and social distancing, of course, but I hope you can join us. Our talk tonight is Influencing the Influencers, an evolving approach to driving climate change, with Woodwell Climate Research Center Executive Director Phil Duffy, Communications Officer Heather Goldstone. Woodwell Climate Research Center was founded in 1985 by George Woodwell as the Woods Hole Research Center. It adopted its current name in 2020, emphasizing its focus on climate change research and the role the center takes influencing decisions in the policy of climate action. Now let's welcome Dr. Goldstone, who will give us some background on the research center. Then we'll introduce Dr. Duffy. If you have questions, please put them in chat and we'll answer them at the end. And by the way, we're muting everybody during the talk. And thanks again to Griffin Kerstetter for her tech support, as always. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you, Debbie. Thanks everybody for joining us this evening on a lovely spring evening here on the Cape. I know it's probably a little chilly still for outdoor gatherings, but I know many here may already be vaccinated, and actually getting together might be a temptation. So I thank you for joining us still on Zoom this evening. It's really lovely to be with you, and I really appreciate, Debbie, the opportunity to introduce, or perhaps reintroduce, hopefully reintroduce the center to all of you and the work that we're doing. And Debbie did ask me to give just a little bit of background on the new name and the new brand. And excuse me, I've got a little bit of drumming going on in the background apparently, that was supposed to be done by now. Let me know if that's too loud and I'll go make it stop. But so as Debbie already mentioned, we were founded, of course, as Woods Hole Research Center. The center has been a fixture in the Woods Hole science community since its founding in 1985. But at this point, we are really at a really critical juncture when it comes to the climate crisis. We have less than a decade to have our global emissions. If we want to have a chance of meeting the goals that are laid out in the Paris Agreement, we have less than 30 years to get to net zero. And so when I joined the center a little over a year ago, the feeling was really that we need to be doing more, we need to be moving faster. And the center, everyone was really feeling a need to just have more impact. And this new name was a way to facilitate that, as Debbie said, to make really clear who we are, how we do our work, what we're focused on. First of all, that we're focused on climate change, to make that really clear. And really to recommit ourselves to the founding principles of George Woodwell, that science should be pursued in collaboration with policymakers and societal decision makers in mind from the very beginning in order to have the greatest impact. And so that was really the impetus for the new name. And then I'm just going to address what I'm sure would be a question if we didn't already raise it, which is, okay, but why change the logo? And if you haven't heard this already from our colleagues at WHOI or at MBL, one major factor there is simply that, unfortunately, the beautiful, intricate logos of years past just don't work in our digital age. They don't work when they're on a little tiny phone screen, when they're on social media and that sort of thing. But beyond that, there was also a really substantive reason with this new name, with this feeling of urgency, to really make sure that we had a visual identity that matched that sense of urgency. And so the logo here that you can see that on Phil's slide, that orange was really motivated by that sense of urgency, a warning color that's recognized as that universally, also combined with the curve of the Earth, right? That what we are studying and what is at stake is our planet, is the Earth. And it was those two things together that really led to this new logo. So I know that often those inside an organization imbue more meaning to a logo than those who are just seeing it in passing, but that's the story behind that logo. So especially given the continuing drumming, I am going to hand things over to Phil. Phil is a physicist, literally a rocket scientist, who switched from rockets to climate science early in his career and has dedicated 3+ decades to not only doing, but also sharing, communicating the science that we need to address the climate crisis. He joined the center a little over 5 years ago after a stint in the Obama White House in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, advising on climate change and on global change research. And I'm going to hand it over to him for a brief presentation to kind of introduce some of our work and how we do our work in partnership with decision makers, and then we'll be sure to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So Phil, over to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Heather, for the introduction. Thank you, Debbie, for inviting Heather and me to speak tonight. And thank you all for taking the time to join us. I know many of you know us well, and indeed are great fans and supporters of the center, so thank you for that. And for those of you who don't know us, I appreciate the opportunity to introduce you to us and our mission and our work. And I'll start with a premise which is central to everything which we do, which is that a safe and stable climate, or achieving a safe and stable climate, is the greatest challenge of our time. And without that, we cannot have the healthy and functioning biosphere that is essential to all life on Earth, including human life and human prosperity. And so to meet that goal of stabilizing climate at a safe level, we believe that we need science-based policies and science-based decisions throughout society. And if you needed any reminder of that, I think the recent experience, the ongoing experience with COVID, again, reminds us that policies based on science work, policies based on wishful thinking don't work. So our mission is simple. Our mission is to produce and deliver the science needed to inform societal policies and decisions, particularly around climate change. And as Heather mentioned, that's been our mission since we were founded by George Woodwell back in 1985. And that, of course, that mission hasn't changed, but it's become more important and certainly more urgent over time as greenhouse gases continue to accumulate in the atmosphere. So we're, as you know, we're a relatively small organization, although we've grown recently. We have about 75 employees, and we're a very science-focused organization. So one of the challenges we have is, how do we, as a small science-based organization, how do we have the impact, the societal impact that we want to have? And a big part of the answer to that is through working with partners. And the idea of partners is these are folks who put the science that we do to work every day in the work that we do. And again, this provides us with a vehicle to advance our mission, to have the impact that we want to have. And so what I'm showing here are logos from various of the partners that we work with. And I won't go through all these, but I'll just call your attention to the fact that we have represented here entities in the private sector, also large conservation organizations, and a coalition of indigenous groups, a social justice organization, and in the bottom right, an NGO, which we work with very, very closely, and is in fact involved in everything we do in the Amazon. So we work with some of the richest people in the world. We work with some of the poorest people in the world. We work with folks all over the world. And again, these partnerships are a key vehicle for putting our science to work and making a difference in the world. I want to just review a couple of things which I think distinguish us from other research organizations. And one is pretty simple, and that is we work on questions which have immediate societal relevance. We're not ivory towers. So the sorts of questions we work on are, for example, how much carbon can be stored in forests and where? How does a warming Arctic affect extreme weather at mid latitudes where we live, and so on. The other thing I'll mention about is how we work, and that is in some cases, in many cases, we work with partners throughout the research process. So for example, we have about a 2 or 3 year old relationship with the large investment firm Wellington Management. And the way that partnership works is at the beginning of every year, we work with them to determine, okay, this is going to be the research agenda for the year. These are going to be the questions we'll look at. And then as we proceed through the research, we work very, very closely with them. We refine the questions, refine the answers. And it takes a lot of time and effort, but what it achieves is then the partner gets the information that they truly need, and we get the satisfaction of knowing that, okay, the work that we do is actually going to be used and make a difference in the world. So that's sort of a high-level view of what we do and why we do it and how we do it. And what I'll just spend the next maybe 10 or 15 minutes talking about is at a little higher level of specificity, some of the questions that motivate the work that we do. And what I hope to convey is that there are some really critical unanswered questions in climate science which are essential to helping us manage this challenge of climate change and ensuring that we have a safe future. So a whole lot of our work comes under a heading which I characterize as realizing the potential of natural climate solutions. The term natural climate solutions means managing forests, wetlands, soils, and so forth in ways which actually cool the planet. And you probably know that historically, management or really mismanagement of these systems through, for example, deforestation, has been a major contributor to climate change, and in fact remains a major contributor to climate change. But it's also true that proper management of these natural systems can be a powerful tool in removing climate change by actually removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So under this heading of realizing the potential of natural climate solutions, it means both avoiding greenhouse gas emissions by, for example, by stopping deforestation, and it also means reversing greenhouse gas emissions by, for example, through reforestation. And so either way, it comes down to keeping carbon in the ground and keeping it out of the atmosphere. And here's an example of what that work looks like. And this is, I think, if I may say, a beautiful map. And it's a map having to do with soil carbon. We label this as soil carbon debt. So what does that mean? Soil carbon debt it's an estimate of how much carbon has been lost from soil through the practice of agriculture, through tillage, essentially, going back to the beginning of agriculture 8,000 or 10,000 years ago. And you can see that, areas which have been heavily cultivated, you see the darker shades on this map, meaning that those soils have lost a lot of carbon to the atmosphere. Now, if you, and you can see also, I think that this is a very, very granular map, a very detailed map. If you add all of this up, the total amount of carbon lost from soil through agriculture, again, this goes back to the beginning of time, is equivalent to about 13 years worth of human carbon dioxide emissions. So it's a really, really significant amount. Now, the societal significance of this is that, what goes up must come down, or something like that, meaning that this carbon which has been lost from agricultural soils can in principle be put back through proper agricultural techniques, sometimes known as regenerative agriculture. And so what this is showing not only is that there's huge potential for removing carbon from the atmosphere through regenerative agriculture, but also where that potential exists. And so this sort of map can inform and is used to inform specific projects. So I'll say that while the theoretical potential is enormous, we won't achieve, well, certainly won't achieve the full potential in practice. There's just too many practical difficulties. But again, even if we could achieve a fraction of the theoretical potential, in terms of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere through agriculture, it would be enormously impactful. So this is some of the science that we've done on natural climate, just one example of the science we've done on natural climate solutions. And here's an example of how it's put to work. And we've used this, our work on natural climate solutions to develop decarbonization plans for the European Union, for the country of Poland, and also some work we did with the World Economic Forum on how to stimulate economic investment in these natural climate solutions pathways. So the second sort of big question that we look at is I'm calling uncounted emissions from natural sources. And I'll just illustrate this with an example. And this example was raised as long ago as 1986 by George Woodwell in his Senate testimony. And the example is greenhouse gas emissions from thawing permafrost. So let me show you, here's a map. Permafrost is ground which has been frozen for a very long time. Most of it is in the Arctic, and much of the Arctic, in fact, is permafrost. Permafrost is, well, it contains a lot of undecomposed organic matter. It's ground that's been frozen usually for tens of thousands of years. And so this represents a global threat because this frozen ground contains an enormous quantity of carbon. We think it contains about twice as much carbon as is now in the atmosphere. And of course, and as George Woodwell foresaw in 1986, the Arctic is warming faster than the rest of the planet. As the Arctic warms, this ground is thawing, and as it thaws, that ground is decomposing and emitting greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And so why is this a threat? It's a threat partly because it's of the enormity of the amount of carbon that's held there. It's a threat partly because this process of warming and thawing and emitting greenhouse gases is a self-reinforcing process, right? Because as the Arctic warms, the greenhouse gases come off of the permafrost, which of course can add to the warming, which adds to the thawing, and so on and so forth. And so the potential exists for it is a self-reinforcing cycle of warming, which of course is potentially catastrophic for humanity. So what are we doing about it? Well, our work really has two elements, and represented by the two photos here. And the first element, of course, is the science, which we do. And we are one of the first groups to actually measure greenhouse gas emissions coming off of thawing permafrost. And so that's represented in the image on the left, which is two of our scientists, Sue Natali, who leads our Arctic program, and Max Holmes on the left, who's our deputy director. And you can see them, they're drilling a permafrost core. But one of the main goals of our work in the Arctic is simply to measure as accurately as we can, what are the greenhouse gas emissions? How rapidly is this process, which I just described, happening? How much greenhouse gases is the Arctic emitting now, and how much will it emit going forward into the future? And it's a challenging question because the Arctic is a very, very big place. It's a difficult environment to work in. And it turns out that the greenhouse gas emissions vary a lot from place to place. And so you can't really get an accurate estimate just by measuring a few places and then multiplying. So that's kind of the uber scientific challenge of which underlies a lot of our work in the Arctic. I should say we also work on the local consequences, the regional consequences of warming, which are really, really significant. The other element of the work is indicated in the image on the right, and that is the policy element. And one of the things that's important to know about permafrost and greenhouse gas emissions from thawing permafrost is that this is a significant source of emissions which is not on the books. It's not included in climate models, and it's not included in so-called carbon budgets. It's not considered in United Nations and national commitments to the Paris process. It's not considered in climate policies generally. So it's a significant source of emissions, which right now is uncounted and ignored. And that's a big problem. And so a part of our work is about fixing that, is about bringing these emissions, measuring them and bringing them to the attention of policymakers. And the image on the right shows Sue Natali addressing delegates at a UN climate conference. I think this was the Paris conference a few years ago. I should also add that our work, the policy element of this work is done in partnership with John Holdren and colleagues at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Okay, one more theme of our work, which I'll talk about, and this is characterized as understanding the human toll of climate change. And what this is about well, part of what this is about, and I think perhaps the most important part of what this is about, is simply illustrating what's at stake, right? And the things that we talk about can seem very, very abstract, right? And we talk about limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, limiting global warming to 2 degrees. We talk about what a catastrophe it would be if the planet warmed up 3 degrees. But it's really hard to grasp that, I think, at an intuitive level or at an emotional level, because 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees doesn't sound like a lot, right? I mean, it's 3 degrees warmer today than it was yesterday, and why is that a problem, right? So what does that mean? What does global warming mean in human terms? And so a big theme of this element of the work is translating changes in the physical world into human terms. We call that socioeconomic consequences. It means like looking at things like increases in food scarcity, water scarcity, impacts on human health, economic consequences, and so forth. And by translating these changes in the physical world into human terms, I think it's really, really important, again, for helping folks just understand what is at stake. And that, I think that can be a very powerful motivator for action to help control the problem. The other value of this work is that simply, it's good to know what's coming, right? So this work is based on our modeling of physical risks, things like storm surge, things like flood, things like wildfire, and so forth. And just on a very basic level, folks need to know what those risks are going to be over the next several decades so that they can prepare. And I'm going to show you just one example of how we take physical risk information and translate it into socioeconomic terms. And so here's a map, 2 maps. You can see that this is South Asia, and the panel on the left is showing it's a model estimate of the yearly probability of a dangerous heat event. And that's here means 3 days above, well, where the so-called wet bulb temperature exceeds a value of 34 Celsius. Now, what is wet bulb temperature? Wet bulb temperature is a measure of extreme heat that combines actually heat and humidity. And it's specifically designed to measure susceptibility of humans to heat stress. And so 34C is a very, very dangerous level of heat and humidity. It's basically not consistent with human life. And so what this map is showing is that in large portions of South Asia, the likelihood of this threshold being exceeded, and in fact being exceeded for 3 days in a row by the middle of the century, will be very, very substantial. And the map on the right, this is some work we did with folks at McKinsey, translated this into human terms, one of the impacts of these very, very high heat and humidity conditions is inability to work outside. Okay, so what's shown on the right is fraction of outdoor labor lost due to extreme heat. And again, this is a projection for 20 to 30 years in the future. And what you can see is that it becomes very difficult. It's just simply too hot and humid to work outside. Now, this, of course, is an area which, well, it's already very hot and humid, but also this is a developing economy. outdoor labor through, for example, agriculture and construction is very important in this part of the world. And so this level of heat and humidity really, I think, what this shows is that this level of heat and humidity impacts their ability for their economy to grow. And this is how some of this work has been publicized, and this is again we've worked over the last year or two with the McKinsey Global Institute, which is essentially a think tank associated with McKinsey & Company, the consulting firm, and working with them, or we've contributed to 10 or 12 of these high visibility reports which they put out and which are widely read by folks throughout the private sector. And this is just covers of several of those. So I want to close with a couple of thoughts about institutional values which underpin everything that we do. And one of these, of course, is that climate change is partly an equity problem in that the folks who have contributed least to the problem feel the most consequences from the problem. And this is true at the level of communities. It's also true at the level of nations. The developing world has contributed relatively little and yet feels the most of the harm. Feels a disproportionate amount of the harms from climate change. It's also true across time, right? In the sense of there's a big intergenerational equity problem, meaning that decisions which we make or don't make have profound consequences for future generations. And of course, those generations have no voice in making those decisions. So everything that we do is informed by this view of climate change as an equity, partly as an equity issue. Something else, and I'm mentioning this particularly because we do work with folks in the private sector, is that we are committed, well, we believe that science is a public good, and climate science in particular is a public good, and so we are committed to the free and open distribution of everything that we do. So all of our work is made public, is freely distributed, the models, the results, the data, everything. And that includes work that we do with folks in the private sector. All of it is made available to the public or anyone who wants it for free. And so this, we've made the decision that advancing our mission requires us to forego opportunities to sell the work, to monetize the work, and instead, again, we've committed to making it freely available to everyone. And we rely on philanthropic support from generous individuals and foundations and so on to make that possible. So thank you again for your time. Thank you for your interest. I'd be happy to answer any questions, and maybe I could stop. Maybe I'll stop sharing my screen at this point so I can see more faces.
Great. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, we are happy to take questions. We have plenty of time for questions. By design, I'm a little biased in this sense, but I think those questions tend to be the most interesting part of most of these events. So feel free to drop questions in the chat, or for that matter, to use the raise hand feature. I think actually I can see everybody on the screen. So if you want to also just raise a physical hand with your camera on, happy to do that. And while there are questions starting to show up in the chat, Phil, I might just piggyback on one of the last things you said there and ask you to elaborate a little bit more on how kind of the bent of some of our partnerships and impact work has changed over 35 years, and how we pick who we work with. And you were mentioning the science as a public good and freely available. What are also some of the kind of guardrails or constraints we put around the way that we work with folks to ensure that we do have that control and that ability to make it public?
No, that's a great question. And sometimes folks are well, sometimes the fact that we work with folks in the private sector and some big actors in the private sector raises eyebrows. And so first of all, why do we do that? And fundamentally, it's pretty simple, and it comes from a belief that the private sector has to be a big part of the solution to climate change. And as Heather likes to say, we can't solve climate change if we only work with folks who are already on board. So we do recognize risk working with folks in the private sector. And so what we've done is we've developed a set of criteria that we use to assess all potential partners, including private sector partners. And we've given, we gave some thought to that, and those criteria were approved by our board. And I'll just mention some of them right now. I've already mentioned the fact that all the work that we do is made public. And so partners who won't agree to that, who want to keep the work confidential, we simply won't work with, and we have walked away from opportunities like that. We also won't work with anyone whose mission is opposed to ours, for example, fossil fuel companies. And I'll add that we have had opportunities to work with fossil fuel companies and to get funded by fossil fuel companies, and we've walked away from them. And among other things, I know George Woodwell would kill me or disown me if we did that. But and further, we don't feel we wouldn't want to work with anyone who, where that would compromise the perceived objectivity of our work. So we recognize there's risks associated with working with all partners, but we feel like the value of it. Well, we try to make sure that the value of it does in fact outweigh those risks.
Great. Related to that, question in the chat from Becky Sue is, has Woodwell always made their research public?
It hasn't been, I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, honestly, it hasn't been much of an issue until recently. And the reason it becomes an issue is precisely because of growing private sector interest in climate change. I mean, historically, research was funded by the federal government, to some extent by private foundations. The federal government requires that the work be made public, and so that's been the tradition. I mean, what's happened though in recent years is that climate science actually has commercial value in the marketplace, and in fact there's a small but growing cottage industry of companies, startup companies here in Silicon Valley, which in fact do climate modeling, risk modeling, which is very, very similar to the risk modeling which we do, but they're selling it for a profit, and so their models are secret, their data is secret, and so again, this is all a relatively new development.
So you mentioned that one of the major areas that we work on is natural climate solutions, and touched on that a little bit as it relates to soil. So there's a question here. I just read Bill Gates' book on combating climate change, and he naturally sees it as a technocratic solution. Could you discuss that? For example, he believes strongly in chemical fertilizers, new energy solutions. That's the question in the chat. I'll maybe add to that or morph it a little to let you know what's the relative role of technological solutions versus natural solutions.
Yeah. Okay, great question. Thank you. Well, first of all, I haven't read Bill Gates's book, so I won't comment on the book, but I'll answer Heather's question or the audience member's question. Well, we do certainly need new low carbon energy solutions. I mean, wind and solar are great for certain purposes, but you can't run a steel mill on wind and solar or solar. And so heavy industry, for example, needs different solutions. Aviation needs different solutions. So we have part of what we need, technologically, not everything. And of course, we're not using the solutions that we do have as much as we should. So there's a lot that we can simply do right now without developing any new technology. The other element of this whole challenge, which I touched on earlier, is we need to find ways of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that's where nature-based solutions play a really important role. And I showed you this map of the potential for soils to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And that's one pathway. Forests are the biggest, actually the biggest pathway. And that's absolutely critical. And it's something we can do now. We know how to do it. It's pretty inexpensive. And most of the knock-on effects are beneficial. So that's a big part of the solution. If you look at how much CO2 we think we need to remove in order to limit climate change to an acceptable level, it seems like natural solutions are a big part of the puzzle, but not the whole puzzle. So I think we do need technological means for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And we really don't have those right now. I mean, we have little demonstration capabilities which work, but they're very expensive and they're very energy intensive. So that's an area where we need to, well, that's a problem we need to solve.
All right. Two great questions from Griffin here that maybe I will split apart because both of them are really big, weighty questions. And the first is, do you think the goals set forth in the Paris Agreement are achievable?
Yeah, it depends what you mean by, well, it depends what you mean by achievable. I think with sufficient political will, probably so. We don't have the political will right now to do what needs to be done. I don't see, well, 1.5 degrees, if you just look at the numbers, if you look at what has to be done, and if you consider, as we do, including the emissions from thawing permafrost, it's just not happening. I mean, there's simply no way. Well, by 2050, we will be well past 1.5 degrees. So I don't think it's going to stop there. 2 degrees is an easier goal to achieve. And again, I said we need more technology, but we need more political will. I mean, we need to organize ourselves as a society in service of our longer term goals rather than squabbling over short-term advantage.
I actually want to hear the end, but I think we can.
So I will, so Griffin's second question, I'm going to expand on a little bit. I mean, you said mostly what we're lacking in order to potentially achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement is political will, but what in your mind, not the exact mix of energy sources, but generally speaking, what is it that we need to do in order to meet those goals? What do we need the political will to do, and what can individuals do to help with that?
Yeah. I mean, at the highest level, it's pretty simple. It's like stop adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. I mean, that's easy to say, hard to do. We need to stop adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And because we've not done that for so long now, we need to actually reverse that process, and we need to remove a lot of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And those are big, big challenges. I have a lot of confidence in human ingenuity. When people put their minds to things, they can accomplish amazing things, right? I mean, we developed these incredible COVID vaccines in less than a year, right? And nobody thought that was going to be possible. So, what worries me is that we're not trying. And even though there's a lot more focus on climate change now than there was even 2 years ago, there's a lot of talk, but a lot less action. Okay, so what can individuals do? And I'll focus on 3 things. And one is, I do think it's important to set an example in your own lifestyle. And the reason for that is not so much that the emissions of one human being really matter on a global scale. Honestly, they don't. But you have the ability to set the norms, right? You have the ability to change what's normal and accepted, and your behavior influences the behavior of others, and that can be very, very powerful. And it's really important for folks like you who are leaders who care about this issue to set an example in your personal lifestyle. So that's one thing I would say. The other thing is to get involved and to get involved politically. And there's all kinds of ways to do that. You can get involved at the local level. You can get involved at a state level. You can run for Congress. And you can also just communicate with your elected representatives. Tell them you care about this issue. Tell them that this issue determines how you vote. That gets their attention. And you know, particularly at a local level, it doesn't take a lot of folks to swing an issue one way or another. So I would say getting involved politically is another thing. And then the other thing is there's all kinds of great organizations who are working on every aspect of climate change. And, you know, I think we're one of them, and we have a sort of a science focus. There's all kinds of great advocacy organizations, League of Women Voters, there's conservation organizations. And I mean, the great thing about climate change is that it's such a big problem that pretty much, you know, whatever your interest is, whatever your talent is, whatever you like to do, I think can be put to work in service of meeting the challenge.
I'll second that for sure. You mentioned kind of the parallel to the pandemic and the fact that we've managed to develop vaccines in under a year. I mean, just over a year ago, as we were all going to remote work from home and going into lockdown situations, lots of climate scientists were talking about the parallels between the pandemic and climate change. Some of the most overt being just, okay, this is a problem that we can understand through science, and some people are ignoring the science. But as the pandemic wound on, we started to also hear things like, well, everybody being at home and not commuting and not flying has reduced greenhouse gas emissions by several percent this year. I wonder, what are some of the lessons at this point, like a year plus into the pandemic, at least in the United States? What are some of the things that stand out for you as maybe lessons we could learn, or things to take out of the past year from the pandemic, looking forward to doing more on climate change?
Well, I'll start with the sort of scientific thoughts. And yeah, well, the so-called shutdown, which, well, whatever, the slowdown in economic activity due to COVID restrictions did reduce emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere by about 7%. And well, a lot of folks were and are confused about emissions to the atmosphere versus concentrations in the atmosphere. Emissions is how much we add every year. Concentrations is how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. And I was actually interviewed on news shows saying, wow, emissions went way down. Isn't this a shock to the atmosphere? Isn't it going to cool off suddenly? I was asked. And no, it's not going to cool off, because in fact, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere didn't go down. It actually kept going up. It just went up about 7% more slowly than it would have absent COVID. So I think it's a lesson in how difficult it really is to manage this challenge, because as massive as the disruption was, it really didn't reduce our contributions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere by all that much. So that's one thing. I hate to say it, but I'll say it anyway, and I don't want to get political, but I think one of the big lessons of COVID is that leadership matters. And being honest with folks about the challenge, asking them to pitch in, asking them to sacrifice, which is something no one's willing to do anymore, I think has to be part of how we manage this. And that sort of leadership, rather than politicization, would have gone a long way with COVID. And as you know, climate change has also been very highly politicized. And I'll just say one more thing about that, and that is one of the other parallels in my mind is a false trade-off between safety and economic prosperity, right? And the argument, well, in both, in the cases of COVID and the case of climate change, the argument for not acting is to preserve economic prosperity. But the reality is, I think that's exactly wrong. I think that we cannot have, in fact, prosperity without controlling these challenges. We can't have prosperity if COVID's running around. We can't have prosperity if climate is changing rapidly. And so we need to address these challenges precisely because we want to ensure our economic prosperity.
There's one question here that I'll take a first stab at, and Phil, jump in if you're aware of work that I'm not. But the question is, are you aware of the novel mystery genre called cli-fi, which is short for climate fiction? And if so, do you work with any cli-fi writers? And to my knowledge, we have not yet worked with any cli-fi writers. I am, I would say, an on and off fan of the genre, and I'm a fan until I've had a little bit more of the apocalypse than I can handle for a period of time, and then I go off it for a while. But certainly, I have some personal favorites in that genre, and we have actually talked about how much fun and potentially how powerful it could be to do some events where we pair our scientific understanding of what the future might look like with speculative fiction authors' perspectives on what the future might look like, not only in terms of climate itself, but in terms of society and their responses to it. So I think it's a great idea, and it's something we've talked about. And Phil, if you want to chime in any more there.
Well, no, I think that's great. I mean, I'll say we have, I'll say, dabbled a little bit in working with creative types, and I believe that we have to be open to different ways of reaching folks, and and as a scientist, I feel comfortable saying, science lessons aren't a great way to change minds and reach people, and I recognize that. So we need every approach we can get.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a scientist in residence, an artist in residence program, and currently working with a fabulous journalist turned artist, Justin Bryce Gorelia, who works in multiple different media, including actually tattoo work on his own body, which depicts changes in carbon dioxide and temperature on tattoos on his arms. So a very brilliant and interesting person to talk with about climate issues, and like Phil said, so powerful to see these issues just portrayed in a completely different way. Let's see here. We've got another question, which, Cherie, I'm not sure I understand your question entirely. So if you want to unmute and chime in to clarify here, you ask, how have your efforts reached out to, quote, already solved that international colleagues? Cherie, I saw you unmute. So do you want to expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, I took my mute off. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. So there's a few cases, not a lot, but a few cases of situations, or I would say day-to-day kind of living, where they've solved, or at least are making efforts to have a less environmental or climate change impact. And I just wondered what your efforts are around collaborating with that. I'm assuming you're connected to all of that information and data and whatnot. I think about a recent trip to Amsterdam and seeing, that was a crisis. I mean, they have to keep that water or they drown, right? And so, and then there's lots and lots of images or examples where there have been those situations. So I'm just questioning or asking, what have those collaborations been for you guys?
Well, one of the things I love about the United States is we keep trying to resolve problems that others have already solved, right? And things like healthcare, which the Europeans have done a pretty good job at, and things like education, we keep thinking that's an unsolved problem. And so I love the premise of your question, which is that a lot of the solutions have been invented, and
Yeah.
and that's right, and they have been invented, and as I said, they haven't been applied as widely as they should be. Our work as a scientific organization is hugely international. I mean, our scientists do work with folks all over the world, and we also have folks on the ground implementing. Well, I showed you pictures of folks in the Arctic.
Yes.
We normally have a lot of folks in the tropics, in the Amazon, in the DRC. Now, because of COVID, we've temporarily pulled back on that.
Yeah. But I also feel like there's a lot, particularly our European ancestors,
Yeah.
many of us, that, they're doing the small little things that have an impact over time. And it's not oh, it would be a feel good thing. It's like, you got to do this.
Yeah.
Kind of
Well,
thing.
some of our non-European, non-ancestors also have smart ways of doing things. I heard a talk this morning on Western U.S. wildfire, which is actually really interesting. And one of the points the speaker made was that the indigenous folks, historically over thousands of years, had very sophisticated ways of managing fire through controlled burns and so forth, which we conveniently forgot.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why we have this wildfire crisis here is the climate change deniers like to pretend that it's entirely due to forest mismanagement, and that's not true at all. It's probably mostly due to climate change, but fuel buildup is certainly part of the challenge.
Great. Thanks so much.
Phil, we've just got a few minutes left, and I don't see any more questions popping up in the chat. So maybe I'll ask one last question of you. And I think you shared a little bit about what keeps you up at night in terms of things like permafrost thaw and what the challenges are in terms of both political will and the tools that we need to address this. So let's end on a slightly different note. What gives you hope, or what fuels your optimism?
Well, I'll answer in one word, and that kids. Is the youth movement and the involvement of young folks and their insistence on addressing this challenge and so many other challenges and so many of the things that we've done to mess the world up, and their insistence on incorporating social justice into everything that we do, and it's just so I love seeing that. And I will say, part of what I hear from the folks in the private sector is that they're getting involved in climate change, and they're changing their practices. And what the leaders tell me is that a big part of that is driven by their own employees. The young folks won't come to work for them if the organization doesn't act in a responsible way. And folks want to work at a place that has some sense of purpose that goes beyond making money. And that's music to my ears, and that is a very heartening thing.
Absolutely. Great. Well, Debbie, I guess we can hand it back over to you here. We've got a couple minutes before the top of the hour.
Okay. Thank you both so much. I've learned a lot, and it's been very thought-provoking. We've recorded this. It will be on our website. So check that when you want to see it, or refer it to your friends. And thank you all for being here. So.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to reintroduce you to us and our work. Really appreciate it.
Great. All right.